Hey everyone, good afternoon to you, or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to Midnight Hatter Live, the weekly variety show where we talk Gundam gaming and Gunpla. I am Steven, aka your host, Midnight Hatter, and of course, joining me as always is the Gundam explainer, Blue Gamer, Adam Blue. How are you, sir?
Hey, doing good, doing good. I like the topic that you have prepared. It got my mind going, so I think this is going to be a good discussion. Yeah, considering part of the discussion we already had this week on Free Speech Geek, that was a good one. So guys, check that out if you haven't. But
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, I was thinking about this because last week on the Gundam Explained show, we were talking a lot about the Gunpla that have come out this year and a lot of the advancements in Gunpla in general. And, it got me thinking about, well, what kind of advancements have they made in like engineering? And then I started to think about like, well, it really comes down to the designs themselves, right? So let's talk about that. And, I was like, well, Adam and I love tech trees and we love following the design lineage of
yeah.
different things. And so in the spirit of that, I'm wearing my Anaheim Electronics shirt so that we can talk
That's
about
cool.
the evolution of mobile suits throughout the years. We're going to be mainly talking about them in the sense of real world. Like we're going to be talking about the mechanical designers. We're going to be talking about the visuals and things like that. So I hope you guys are excited for that subject. Again, links down in the description to Free Speech Geek and of course Adam's content. Yeah, you dropped a video this morning. I can't believe I forgot it because I dropped a comment
Oh,
on it.
oh, the Master Asia. Uh,
Master Asia. Yeah,
yeah.
because I was like, when am I gonna get my Ruluka action figure?
I didn't see that. But that's a great idea for an action figure.
I mean, it's crazy to me, like, the of all of the Gundam, figures that we've gotten, excluding the robot spirits, I'm talking about specifically, like, the
Yeah,
humanoid figures. It's like we've gotten nothing from Zeta, Double Zeta, and onward. It's like you got a couple
yeah.
One Year War, Gundam Guy generation type figures, but
Oh, I would love to get some, yeah, action figures from that time, especially how they are really infusing that animation look, even that
yeah.
Master Asia. By that time, the art and animation was a little different, a little more filled in. So if you think about like the classical look of 79 Amuro as an action figure, I feel like it's gonna have some neat, interesting proportions if they do go that way. That
Yeah,
route.
I think
Yeah.
so, and it would be very cool if they outsourced that production to SH Figure Arts like they did, for the
Oh yeah.
Master Asia figure,
Yeah.
instead of doing everything in-house, right?
Yeah, like
Or I
the
think it's
because they
Mega House does the
yeah, Mega House has the small ones, and then Bandai does have the Figure Eyes, which are they look really good, but they're really just model kits and a little more fragile, but they do
yeah,
look pretty good. Yeah.
very cool. Well, we'll be talking a little bit about the model kits today, and of course, speaking of model kits, you've been mentioning this on the Gundam Explained podcast, I might as well mention it here as well. PrexHobby.com, has been a, proud affiliate of both of us. They are one of the only P Bandai distributors that we know of in Canada. So,
Yeah.
for those of you up in the north that are having a hard time getting your hands on P Bandai, check out PrexHobby.com.
Yep.
Um, all right, so I'm about to jump into our topic in chief, but I can't help but notice I'm looking at our screens and the light source seems to be bleeding into each other, and it looks like we're in the same room. It's
That
kind
is
of
pretty amazing, actually. That
it's kind of
Huh.
sweet. There's like this pink hue that covers both of our
Yeah,
shoulders, and I'm like,
and they're
okay,
meeting at the same yeah, that's interesting. That
never
would be
had that
cool if
happen
we were
before.
doing this live somewhere in a studio.
One day
One
that is
day.
going to be the case.
Yeah.
And speaking of live events, I did mention this briefly on Twitter and over on Discord, but I want to make it, publicly announced for everyone here. September 7th, which is the first Saturday of next month, when the Gundam Base mobile tour comes to Richmond. I'm trying to organize a little get together, a little meetup. I'm going to bring some special gifts to hand out to everyone who says hi there. We'll just chill out, maybe do some live streaming and talk about like our impressions while we're there on site and yeah, get some pictures with folks and that sort of thing. So, if you are either in the area or coming to the Richmond, VA area, during that first weekend in September, hit me up either, in the comments here, over on Discord. You guys know where to find us, and let's get something going. We've already got a couple of names, couple big names that are going to be there. So
Wow, that sounds fun. I would love to make it out there. I don't think I can, but I'd love to.
yeah,
I'll
well,
think about it.
definitely gonna organize some more of these in-person events, I think,
Yeah,
going forward because it's something that ever since we've had our conversations with the boys from Zeeg, New York, it's something that we're passionate about doing is getting these kinds of, meetup events
yeah,
organized.
it's fun.
So now that said, I wanted to hop into a look at, Gundams throughout the history of the franchise. We're sitting here at 45 years since the original series aired in 1979. I actually put together this graphic that we are going to be able to use, just for reference purposes. Now, we can talk about like various mobile suits throughout the entire series, but for the purposes of just identifying some key design trends, I thought it would be interesting to look at specifically the the protagonist mobile suit, the protagonist Gundam from some of the main series throughout all of the Gundam franchise, and kind of pick out the differences and sort of evolutionary chain that we've got going on here. Um, so one of the things that I want to first mention is that you know Kunio Okawara, which he recently celebrated. Let me switch tabs over here. I do want to show you guys this. Back in 2016, they opened an exhibit at the Sagawa Art Museum. It was only open for a limited time. It was just a short exhibit going over his 50 years working in anime as an artist, not just as a mechanical designer, but as an artist. And what's interesting is that Mobile Suit Gundam really marked a design shift away from like super robots to real robots to like military sci-fi. It's worth noting that you know, I guess Armored Trooper Votoms is probably everyone's go-to example of like this is what a military robot would look like. But that came 4 years after Gundam. So and it was also designed by Kunio Okawara. So like, it's the same
Yeah.
guy. um and same thing goes for, like, the Maschinenkrieger line, like, that was, I think, 84, 85. So, really, in 1979, Mobile Suit Gundam does, like, really solidify the idea that, look, these are military machines, not just, like, you know, little kid flying a giant robot.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they were doing it, but going as far as they could to make it look like a machine, because it still was kind of more steeped in that aesthetic of being, the super robot, being for kids' toys. So I think a lot of what we're gonna see as we go through this is the that real robot integration comes in, and some artists or some interpretations that he does later on is doubling down on those certain aspects, like the military sci-fi verse, maybe the super robot, but still retaining one or the other.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because it's worth noting that, like, you're gonna see the same designer names pop up frequently throughout the timeline that I've put together, and so it's very interesting to see how the individual styles of each mechanical designer, grow and change along with that. And, so I wanted to also bring up this tweet that I made years and years ago, about Kunio Okawara because, like you said, focusing in on that sort of militaristic design because he said, and this is from the NHK documentary, Making Gundam. Um, he said they weren't going to make toys of the enemy Xeon suits. So it's like the Gundam, the gun cannon, and the gun tank were designed to be more in that super robot vein because they were intended to be toys. But because they weren't going to make toys of the villain units, that allowed him the creative freedom to make them a little more militaristic and play with that design a little bit more.
Yeah,
I
and the
think
fact that even with the non-toy mobile suit designs, it went for that more, I guess, curvature look, the more bulbous, round look, which is interesting because then knowing that it's not going to be necessarily a toy, then what is the motivation knowing you don't have to design for a toy, but design for that? Is it being able just to have the freedom, or is it maybe during 1979, military sci-fi things were a little more curved and rounded? So,
That's a very good point. I'm not sure exactly where that curved aesthetic came from, but I mean, personally, I'm a fan of it. I'm a big fan of, like, Akira Toriyama's mechanical designs for, like, the Red
mm,
Ribbon Army in Dragon Ball. So yeah, that curved design seems to be something that's, I mean, you see it in Votoms and in
yeah.
Machine and Krieger designs too. So there's something about this, like, curvature in military mecha design, and I'm not sure what the sort of origin of that is. If anybody knows, definitely let us know in the chat because that is,
Yeah, because to
um
me, it stands out, and even when I first saw Gundam, it almost stood out almost in a negative way to where I'm like, "Well, this looks super abstract," but the more you then see the designs, you realize, "Oh, this actually makes sense. It actually does work," and because of a mechanical designer.
yeah, there you go. So yeah, working with the limitation, the only thing that Tomino said is that they had to be Cyclops. They had to have one eye, so
No, that's cool.
but yeah, so hopping back into this timeline that I've created, let me see if we can zoom in and get a better picture of, like, the original Gundam design, which we can see is a lot of flat colors and shapes. I wonder if I can get a little bit more in the screen here. See if we can get a little more visual on this. It'd be ideal if I can get the designers' names in there with us so that we
No,
can actually compare those things. All right.
okay,
So even just from the first series 0079 to Zeta Gundam, we have a huge shift in the aggressive lines, um the angular aesthetic going on, right? Like,
right.
the original Gundam is sort of boxy, and you see a little bit of those smooth lines, like, particularly in the kneecap area, and almost the chest seems to not be as boxy, it kind of curves outward. Am I
No, that's right. Yeah.
reading that right? So, it does have I'm glad that, you mentioned, I forget whether this was on the Gundam Explained show last week or the week before, but you had talked about how the real grade Gundam 2.0 almost has that movie
Oh, yeah.
design language to it, where it's got, like, the kind of bulbous head,
Right.
and I think we've got the same thing kind of going on from this original design drawing, right?
Yeah, I've noticed that. I'm a big fan of kind of the original look of some of the RX-78 heads compared to how it moves forward. Particularly like where the eyes are and where like the helmet visor part is. Sometimes there's like a bigger section where the nose would be between the top of the faceplate and the bottom of the eyes, but sometimes it's not there. And I think that's another interesting aspect. Like
Oh,
in this one, you see more of that there. But also
yeah.
that also has to do with the proportions of the head. There's all these little elements that are always proportioned differently, even though it gives off the same look.
Yeah, it's like the same sort of silhouette, but there's definitely some elements that get stretched and,
Yeah.
exaggerated from certain angles. That's So it's a what I think I love the most about that original Gundam design though is that it's really clean. You don't see a lot of panel lines. There's not a whole lot of not a whole lot of distraction, I would say. And because the limbs are all solid white and then the core is where all of the colors focused and you have primary colors red, blue, yellow, your eyes are almost like drawn straight to the center of the mobile suit, right?
Yeah, and I mean, even just looking outward from there, if you were to try to explain any design decision, it really does a good job of, yeah, even though it's the red, blue, yellow, primary colors, you can explain things away in a very functional manner as if it is designed. Like, I just love the idea of skirt armor, for something
Yeah.
like a giant robot, because that really helps sell the idea that there is this sectional part that wouldn't be exposed, but it could move. Same thing with having the vents on the chest. Yeah, just Yeah, even, on the feet, the little, ankle guards there, that just that's a functional, design decision there. So, while it's kinda streamlined and basic, the elements that are there are for functional purposes.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It almost, like, protects its own weak points, right?
Yep,
And if we were to compare it to, like, a suit of armor, it'd be like those sometimes you'll see armor that has, like, these kind of extended plates that come up around the collar because that would be an area that you needed to be exposed in order to have articulation,
right.
but you want it to be covered in case,
Yeah,
yeah, it's
so
yeah.
no, it's neat how that's kind of been, even a design element, like, even going further down with the double Zeta with all the shields everywhere, you know? Um,
Yeah,
but no, I was gonna say, moving to the Zeta Gundam from the original look. So obviously, there's a couple things that can go on. Is hey, look, the original Gundam was so popular. Yeah, you get to make Zeta, do what you want. Okay, we can hire some more designers. So, like,
yeah.
I wonder at this part, like, the Zeta design is so unique compared to the original 0079, where they're almost completely different things, but there's just enough similarity. Was this the first time in anime, Japanese anime, that we started seeing mobile suit designs like this? Because this doesn't look like a toy.
That's
Y
true, and I wonder if the mobile suits from Zeta were never intended to be toys
Yeah,
because most of their designs, they're not functional. I mean, all you have to do is take one look at the real grade Zeta or any of the master grade Zetas that transform, and it's like, "Oh, yeah,
yeah.
these don't work in real life." And so I did credit Fujita with the design of the Zeta, but it is worth noting that Okawara came back and revised the original drawings. So Fujita, did create the rough draft of the Zeta, which pretty much looks like this.
Mhm.
Um, but then yeah, Okawara came in and kind of tweaked some of the some of the proportions and the colors. So
That's cool. Yeah, 'cause it is so interesting to see, like, I wonder how much the success of Gundam helped, uh, Okawara as an artist evolve his craft, because then some freedoms were almost awarded to him, just for that, because, okay, we can go a little more bizarre. How far can you push realism, you know?
yeah, definitely. And I think that this was probably where I would say Okawara got his no, we'll probably come back to Okawara in the late '90s, and we'll talk about when he
Mm,
gets his most adventurous when it comes to design aesthetic. Um, but I do want to pivot briefly to the Double Zeta because I know that that is your favorite Gundam.
yeah,
Being that it is, like, basically the peak of what you would expect, like, the RX-78 development to become, right? Like
yep,
and it's super aggressive, lots of shields, lots of chunk to it, and it's worth noting that, Makoto Kobayashi, the designer of the Double Zeta Gundam, actually worked on several designs from Zeta Gundam, including the Marasai. I think,
mm,
was there the O as well? Yeah, so within Zeta Gundam and
oh,
Double Zeta Gundam, Makoto designed the Marasai, the Boundock, the Gaza C, the Double Zeta, and the O, among others.
oh, okay.
And so when you look at his particular design style, it is super chunky. He even seems to have that very like Maschinenkrieger, like hard military sci-fi aesthetic to his designs, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty neat stuff. It's funny too when I was looking at the double Zeta shot,
Oh, the
how
one down here?
the kneecap alone is like the size of an arm, you know? But it's neat because that is like like a design decision you can make where, yeah, that's exaggerated, but if we keep it consistent, it's just a unique look.
Yeah. Yeah, and you start to see where where there's this departure from what you mentioned earlier in the RX-78, where a lot of that design was functional, where it's like, okay, the ankle skirt is designed to protect the exposed ankle. The skirt armor is designed to protect the exposed pelvis. When you look at something like the Double Zeta Gundam, you have almost impractical skirting and impractical shields that are protecting, it's like overprotection,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, yeah, it was kind of designed going in that direction, and I guess you can explain it too with, like, how the shoulders are, where everything gets bigger because it's giving more shields, but more areas for thrusters, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a very astute observation is that as we kind of go through the UC line of mobile suits, you start to see more, I guess, how would you phrase this? Like designs that were meant for space, right? Like
Yeah,
things like the
exactly.
Xiong and like the O that's like covered in thrusters because they know that in space you kind of have to have total mobility. You can't just rely on your legs to do all the work for you.
Yeah, and that has been a consistency with these designs, different designers, but it looks like it's also as a group effort, but it is to make it where there certain panels, certain parts of the design is for functionality. I mean, that is a strict like for me, like a strictly like UC antagonist or protagonist design decision. I mean, that's something that I brought up before with how UC is with their suits, but yeah, yeah, it's something that I appreciate going this far in, how they can keep that stuff consistent.
Yeah, I agree. It does seem like there's, at least as insofar as the Universal Century is concerned, there's like a house style. Like maybe
Yeah.
they even have like one of those brand Bibles or something that it's like if you're a mechanical designer working in UC, like you have to reference this guide that like kind of I doubt there's anything that formal, but
But, I mean, it
maybe
could
there
be
is.
and it wouldn't be a bad idea, like, here's 5 in-universe technologies of how hand articulation is done. So, maybe as they're designing it,
Yeah.
they have to be like, "Okay, it has to be within this, and if it's part of this development tree, it would be" so, like, I that would be cool if that is the process, like, every design has to have an explanation.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be crazy, but at the same time, that could be part of the art, is that.
You would hope so, just for
Yeah,
the sake of, like, consistency, and that's something that we talked about, like, a couple weeks ago when we were talking about, Advance of Zeta and Moon Gundam and, like, where they fit in the timeline,
yeah.
right? Like, there's definitely a design language that they're observing, but, doesn't necessarily fit in the timeline where they claim it does,
Right.
you know? You could
Yeah.
argue you could argue both, honestly, and I think that's where we landed when we were
Yeah.
talking with Kyle about it. So now this to me, when Izubuchi takes over for Char's counterattack, it does feel kind of like a return to form because the new Gundam, compared to the Zeta and the Double Zeta, we almost see a simplification. Like everything kind of gets
Yeah.
dumbed down. Well, I don't want to say dumbed down, but simplified back to what you saw from the original Gundam, right? Like
Yeah.
not a lot of panel lines. There's some smooth kinda curvature in the legs. Um, it's to me, the new Gundam is almost like a love letter to the original Gundam design by Izubuchi.
And one way we can explain that in universe could just be this is the next the next true iteration of the Amuro over Char story. So within that, the the engineers that get highlighted or whatever happens to be maybe similar in vein to when the last time Amuro and Char were. You know what I mean? Maybe it was just the right mix of culture that kind of makes these things look or appear that way from before.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. And you even see it with the Rigazi, which, not pictured
Oh,
here,
yeah.
but, like, the Rigazi has almost like a Zeta look that's been stripped down and
Yeah.
has more of, like, the original Gundam color palette because the shoulders are no longer blue, they're white, and so there's something going on here where the Char's counterattack designs almost feel like a natural evolution of what came out of 0079.
Yeah, exactly.
Now it's worth noting these are well, in line, these 3 designers, Kobayashi, Izubuchi, and Kawamori, these were their only shots at Gundam design as far as I know,
Oh, interesting.
these were their only, kind of where they're credited as the lead mechanical designer.
Okay.
And I brought up Kawamori just because here we have an example of a Gundam that's supposed to be, kind of closely related to the RX-78, but clearly the GPO-1. And maybe I'm being unfair by putting in an image of the full burn-in version. The original GPO-1 is closer to the
Yeah.
RX-78. But you do see some added complexity in, like, the rivets, the additional thrusters, a lot more panel lines. What are your thoughts on the Kawamori interpretation of a Gundam?
Yeah, I think it's good that you use this one just because the full burn-in version would be okay. What could the potential of the Gundam design be at that time in universe? But then also, outside of the universe, if we look at what came before, it's interesting how the Kawamori design looks even more like an RX-78 too, and then not just the colors. We can go back to the eyes, for instance, where the new Gundam loses that look that you find from the original RX-78 head, where there's more
Yeah,
of that red that's
exactly.
around the eye part. Also, on the new Gundam, the snout is a little bigger and higher, almost looks like it's a dog snout or an animal style snout, as opposed to the
Interesting.
more samurai mask look from the original RX-78 too. And so that's another design preference I have of why I'm not too crazy about the new Gundam is also
Yeah.
how the classic Gundam and this full burn-in retains that classic mask look.
Yeah, I agree, and I think probably the GPO-2 has the most aggressive, like, samurai mask look to it.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it does, and that's what's interesting because it takes after more of Zeta style as well. Like
Yeah.
it's mixing the styles. So that's
And
another
that's where I
interesting.
have to credit Kawamori because when you look at the full burner and the GPO-2, one of the things that stands out to me is that they almost do feel like an in-between step between the RX-78 and the Zeta Gundam. You know, the full burner has blue shoulders that similar to the Zeta Gundam.
Mhm.
You see that the chest vents go they're slowly kind of compressing down, right? So, like, in the on the original RX-78, you have, like, the 4 panel vents, and then on the Zeta, you have only a single vent, right?
Oh yeah,
But then when you look at the GPO-1, you have this, like, dual vent that's kind of in between.
yeah. That is
Um,
the interesting observation. Yeah,
Similarly, that cockpit area where, the core fighter of the GPO-1 sits is very similar to the cockpit area of the Zeta Gundam. So
yeah,
that flight mode, integration, you kind of see where the thinking is going, where it's like, "Okay, we made a bigger core fighter that kind of represents the entire top half of the Gundam instead of just the tiny core fighter from the original. So now how would he extend that into, here's the entire Gundam transforms into a plane?"
yeah, yeah. That,
And then
that's a
same
good
thing with the
point.
legs. I think that the legs are very similar, like, you have this kind of Zeta-informed curvature
Right.
going on with the GPO-1 that's reminiscent of, like, those bulbous leg, like, especially the calf area on the Zeta.
Yeah, because then we saw the kind of directions that went between like the Mark II, the Alex, and then like the double Zeta, and we get a lot of those later like Dovin Wolf suits where yeah, you can see there's kind of different directions you can go in at this time with the GPO one and all that. It's where they're still experimenting, trying different things, but yeah, it's still like a nice in between.
Yeah,
Um,
I think so. So that's one of yeah, like, all credit goes to Kawamori for designing something that really fits in universe, like, because obviously 0083 came after all of these other series, so it's like
yeah,
having to design within those restrictions, must have been difficult.
yeah,
But it is also worth noting that, the famous designer Hajime Katoki got his start doing 0083 designs. So he didn't do the lead Gundam, but he did do the GPO-3 and a couple of other designs there. It was not until Victory Gundam where we got Katoki as the lead designer for the series. And so
and
the first Gundam that we have from Katoki is the Victory Gundam.
yeah,
Um,
and I love this design. This is especially the artwork, and I think it might be on the DVD, but the one where it looks like it's a painted, like, close-up side shot, and
yeah,
to me, this evokes kind of the ultimate in that real world look of, like, this would be a fighter jet, like, this is the F-18, just there's something about the chest to the way it's designed, like, this
the
is like the ultimate
curvature.
yeah,
Yeah,
ultimate form of a fighter jet as a mobile suit, especially because it also does the transforming. It has like the three-part transformation and all that. So there's a lot of that. Yeah, Katoki did a good job of really taking the classic Gundam design elements, but doubling down on the kind of sci-fi, fighter, integration.
Yeah, that's all very, very good points, and, like, I agree 1,000%, like, to me, this is Kotoki kind of playing conservatively because you can
Yeah.
tell that he's kind of working within the framework of like, okay, I want to make this look like the Gundam. And he does. Like this looks like the RX-78, but almost like you said, fully realized as this would be a military machine that like I could see Lockheed Martin putting out.
Yeah, and I've built the Kotoki master grade, the, high grade, and so I've got a real strong sense of the mechanics of it, and the proportions are great and everything. I mean, even in this shot, and you can sometimes see that where there's this, heavy, reliance on a larger bottom half, just in terms of
Mm,
scaling. I think that just helps with being able to hold its own weight, looking realistic. Kotoki also, a lot of his designs become Gunpla, and
yeah.
so it's almost like he's designing for the toy, even though these designs are influenced by things not being toys.
I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah, like, that Kotoki aesthetic is definitely like the long legs with like a short torso and like you said, they are really designed for the Gunpla. And again, I'm glad you brought up that you built the master grade on this one. Would you say that the master grade has more of those panel lines that make it look more like a more more sci-fi-y? I mean, this artwork here is very simplified compared to what you would probably find on the model kit, right?
It's the same, but what helps is the real type markings.
Gotcha.
Kotoki's signature real type markings.
Yeah.
That really kind of even though it looks great without it, with it, you can see that next level.
And I think that's what I love about this design so much is that it's not, like, kibbly, like, it's not super,
Yeah,
aggressive with the panel lines and with, like, a lot of exposed machinery, and you can see how the realism would be enhanced with decals. Obviously, this artwork doesn't have the decals, and it looks good without it, but with it, it would create that realism without just, like, putting lines all over it, right?
yeah. And what's really neat too is this, Victory Gundam also got its attachment parts, its V2 variant, so, Kotoki was able to, like, kinda continue that tradition and still make it stand out and look great.
Yeah, absolutely. So as far as like, first entries into the series go, Kotoki nailed it, right? Knocked it
Yeah,
out of the park.
yep,
So
exactly.
now we're in the mid 90s and we have a return of the original Gundam designer in Kunio Okawara with Gundam Wing. Yes, I am skipping over F91 and G Gundam, sorry. Um, but I did want to get to this in particular because this is the first time that Okawara has come back and designed for Gundam. And it is, I would say, a far cry from his original designs, right?
Yeah, I wonder if there was this sort of, "Hey, we're putting Gundam in a, different universe again, like, feel free to kinda go down that path," like with G Gundam, how it had all those different things you could do, but Wing kinda goes back to being that military story or the war story, so trying to scale back to be realistic, but at the same time, still going beyond that. I mean, that big glowing gem in the middle, to me, that screams toy,
Yeah,
100%.
for
Yeah.
sure. Even though there is like so I only realized this when I started building the real grade Epion, but there is like a in-universe explanation for why certain Gundams have that big green
Oh,
gem. Is apparently it's like an extra like ocular analysis tool. I forget what they exactly call it. Like it's an additional sensor that's supposed to
yeah.
process battle data, which is some of that pseudo sci-fi kind of thing.
Yeah.
And and what's interesting about Wing in general is like, you look at the Gundam designs and they are so different than like just the standard mobile suits because like the Leo and the Ares definitely have that kind of grounded military look that you might expect from like the guy that did Votoms and,
Oh, yeah.
like they look like Zaku's, like the more realistic military mobile suits. But then the Gundams themselves, the 5 Gundams and Epion, like they definitely have this very, I don't even wanna say super robot because I don't think it's too super robot, but like you said, it's kind of like a toy.
Yeah, there's little elements that are, like, stand out between each one that you could call out that are you wouldn't even say they're necessarily functional for the sake of a sci-fi military weapon, but for the story, the lore, the toy, the Gundam wing, obviously with the wings, and there's more to that when Katoki came back, but also just the other ones. They're the and I forget the names of them that have the claw
Oh,
weapon.
yeah.
So a lot of that stuff, it's interesting. It's an interesting combination of the mechanical design aesthetics, but a toy.
Yeah, and between G Gundam and Gundam Wing is the first time you really see those types of gimmicks applied to the mobile suits, right?
Yeah,
For the most part, Gundams and mobile suits, they're typically all the same. They all have like a gun, a melee weapon. They're all kind of just military units. But then when you get to like G Gundam and everything has this theme around the country that they represent,
yeah,
or in Gundam Wing, where like you said, you've got the Shenlong with its extendable claw, you've got the
that's right.
Death Scythe that has this like
Yeah,
ridiculously impractical weapon. You get into these like they're toy gimmicks. Like, you'd go to Burger King and be like, "Oh, here's the Gundam Death Scythe with shield launching action." Like, it's
yeah,
But you did mention Kotoki's return to the franchise in Endless Waltz, and I thought that this would be an interesting, look because this is the first time that we see Okawara and Kotoki both designing essentially the same mobile suits, but putting their own spin on it, and I think this is probably the only time you've seen it throughout, like, the entire Gundam franchise, but it's just very interesting to me, and this is why I wanted to focus on Wing so much is because you have the original designer, and then you have what I would consider, like, the current, what would you call Kotoki? Like, he's the current, like, authority on Gundam designs, right?
yeah, yeah.
Unofficially.
Right, yeah, there's probably a term for that, but yeah.
Yeah. Um, and honestly, the designs themselves are not too different, but to your point, it's like the legs are extended, the skirts are shortened, the torso is tighter. There's that definitely that like Kotoki flair to that design, right?
Yeah, and something else that Kitoki does is it tends to add, and I think more modern designers do this since Okawara's time, but kinda have more detail to, geometry,
Mm.
of, like, an angle, where not only do you kinda get clear definition of the 3D of the geometry, but also some of the details like the line work. It's where it's not like a complete line or the lines, don't finish exactly. It kind of helps give it more of a texture to where Okawara is very clean in that regard.
Yeah, you'd say, like, it's almost like implied lines that
Yeah. Yeah.
Kotoki uses where,
Mhm.
it's like, for instance, when you look at the upper thigh of the Wing Gundam, you can see where the crease of that fold would continue down to the end of the calf or to the end of the thigh,
Yeah.
but, like, he leaves that line off, and he kinda lets your mind fill in the blanks, right?
Yeah. It kind of gives it more of, yeah, a more 3D look, a more like there would be, yeah, a curve there that couldn't be defined by line art.
Yeah, and I also note that, a lot of his eh, a lot of the sort of components that make up the mobile suit have been broken down into like individual pieces. So like where Okawara has the shoulder pauldrons are like one solid piece, Kotoki takes it and splits it into three. Or
Oh,
where the
yeah.
ankle guard is one solid, C shape around the front of the ankle, Kotoki breaks it up into parts that kind of fold around. And I think that to your point earlier, that was done with the intention of making them more articulated when the model kits or action figures were produced.
Yeah,
Um,
it does seem like Hitoki keeps that in mind, and Okawara doesn't need to.
yeah,
And that coulda just been how it's always been, you know? Uh,
and I don't know too much about Kotoki's background, but if I were to guess, we know that Okawara was a fashion designer before he was a mechanical designer, so that's kind of a
oh, yeah.
funny transition you know from working on like uniforms and clothing you can kinda see how that informs how he designs mobile suits. Kotoki almost approaches it from, like, a production designer standpoint. Like, you could see him designing, like, phone cases or something like this, like, something tactile, something that has,
Yeah.
purpose.
Yeah,
So
because Okawara has kind of that standard silhouette. Like, you know it's him, he's just changing the clothes on it, you know it's that fashion model. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out because, when you take, like, all of the Okawara line art designs and you, like, stack them up, they're all in the exact same pose, and you can
yeah,
definitely see where it's like, "Okay, I have my figure drawing that I then just, like, kind of assemble pieces onto it."
yeah.
Um, so then we have the next Okawara designs, which th I'm just gonna leave this here. What do you think about Okawara's, seed designs?
It's interesting, I think they look better, but I not necessarily for the animation style that then occurs in Seed Freedom, if you know what I mean. Um, just because
Yeah.
this is more mechanical and boxy, but in motion, Seed is more of that exaggerated comic book style. So kind of the way, it reflects in the animation makes more sense. But I like the way this looks too, because this does seem more grounded as opposed to the more superhero look.
That's kinda what I wanted to express was that, like, in Gundam Wing, you get, like you said, it's this super robot look. This almost looks um like, if you were to take the Gundam Wing designs and then make them realistic,
Oh
it's like
yeah.
we're gonna take all of the smooth edges and we're gonna harden them out and make hard edges and makes it like you said, make it look boxy and angular and make it look closer to shoot, even the curvature of the chest reminds me of the Victory Gundam. So
Yeah.
you have that, like, almost aircraft inspired design. But yeah,
Mhm.
it's taking, like, kind of the extreme that he went with Gundam Wing and dialing it back and giving it more of a grounded super robot. I don't know if that's
Yeah, but that would be the way to explain it. I think this is a cool looking, like, I would get a model kit that looks like this. It's just
Yeah,
they
I
don't look like this. I think it's the proportions we were talking about earlier, like,
Yeah.
usually the legs are a little bigger, the chest is a little smaller, even the head is usually a little smaller, like, that's a pretty big head for this,
Yeah, I
but it
do
looks
notice that,
cool.
like, the upper body of this particular drawing, it doesn't really carry over to the model kits or even necessarily the animation, but yeah, the upper body on this drawing is huge compared to the legs.
Yeah.
I would love to see a Verka version of some of these seed designs because
Oh, yeah.
I think that Kotoki would just knock all of the seed designs out of the park, like, if he were to put his spin on them.
Yeah, and isn't it where some of the designers of the Seed mecha were from Macross? If I understand correctly, I could be wrong there, but,
Think that's
I think that
accurate.
was the intention,
And
yeah.
but that's a very good point, is, like, now we're getting into the territory, and I've mentioned this before, both on this show and on Gundam Explained, where it's like, you start getting into the generation of designers that was inspired by mecha designers.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
so now we're kind of 2 steps removed from, like, just pure unadulterated mecha design. Like, it's like, "Oh, well, I like this mecha and not that mecha, so I'm gonna combine them and make my own sort of mecha style," and it's like, Kotoki and Okawara didn't necessarily have that. They were kind of going
Right.
just based off of, like, well, this is what a robot looks like, and then this is what I like to draw that isn't robots. Let's kinda make them work.
Yeah, and so by this time then, as we're getting to Seed, Evangelion has come out and become popular, and that kinda had a different take on design, so I'm sure that influenced people that were already into Gundam. So
And I think we're gonna see that influence creep in here in just a moment.
alright.
So, again, we have another artist who, was kind of a one and done as far as a series leader. For Double O, we had Ebikawa that designed the Exia, as well as a few other, mobile suits from that series. Now, admittedly, again, I didn't finish Double O. Apparently, I have to.
You have to. It's good.
Now,
Um,
what are your thoughts about the Exia as far as, like, in the lineage of Gundam designs, how does it look?
so, yeah, like I said, I love, Double O as a show, but I don't care for this design at all, really. It to me, it just seemed like it's just, let's make a modern looking mecha, that's just more humanoid like an RX-78 is. And then just the little things that are in there. I mean, it's not a bad design. It's just not what I think. Nothing about this stands out. There's like nothing that's like, oh, remember the main Gundam from Double O? It's like, no. What
Sure
it,
don't.
Gundam Wing, I mean, you literally say it, wing. But Double
Yeah.
O, nothing about it.
So, it's kind of interesting. I always criticize when designers go a little too hard on the details like this, where you have a lot of little greebles, a lot of little panel lines,
Oh,
and like
yeah.
components and things like that. Interestingly enough, my eye is actually drawn to the thighs where those gray plates are.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because you actually do have some directional lines going on in the chest, right? You have the vents and you have this giant sort of protruding piece on the lower torso, right? And they all point to nothing.
That's interesting.
When you arrive in the center of
Yeah.
the chest, there's nothing for your eye to focus on. So it's like when you go back to that wing design, like you mentioned, you have that big green gem in the center, right?
Yeah.
And yes, it's kind of goofy. Yes, it doesn't really make sense for, practical reasons. Like they have their pseudoscience reason for why they have these green gems on their
Oh,
chest.
yeah.
But the design reason for it is because it gives your eye a place to focus on in the center of the mobile suit. Like, okay, I see all lines lead to this giant green and the fact that it's green sticking out on this body of white, blue, yellow, and red, right? Like
Yeah.
it's the only color that stands out on this mobile suit.
And
But you don't have that in the Exia.
yeah. And you bring up a good point because, when like, I feel like it's for me, I started noticing this with Double O, but it was very apparent for me with Witch from Mercury. And it's where when you look at these designs, it looks like they're grounded, but like in contrast to what I was talking about earlier, when you start then looking at the other areas, nothing really seems to have any functional design. Even
Mm,
implied, it almost seems like it's just there just to break up the design, and not necessarily that it has function. Whereas the other older suits, you kind of start looking at other elements and you're like, okay, that probably has it looks like it has a function. And so that's
yeah.
the biggest takeaway for me from Witch from Mercury designs was this. It looks like it's grounded, but there's no real function to what I'm seeing.
And I'm glad you made that distinction where it's like even if the designer themselves didn't realize that there was a function to it, maybe it just looked cool to them, it implies that there was a use for it, like that there
Mhm.
was a functional application.
Yeah, like,
Um
and real quick on that,
oh,
Double O suit, when I was talking about the ankle guards before, this one has one on the back, which at first doesn't make as much sense to the eye to, okay, what is that blocking? Because there's already an armor piece back there. Normally that would be for the front to move
yeah.
around, because so that's kind of an example of there's something there. I can't make sense of what it's supposed to do.
Right. It's like you know that it was inspired by the ankle guards of the past because
Yeah,
it has the same look. And so it was like, "Oh, wouldn't it be cool if we took that ankle guard and put it on the back?" And
yeah.
that's what makes it new and different. And it's like, "Well, but the reason it's on the front is because that was the function of it. Whereas putting it on the back defeats the function. You're just making like a reference to it, right?"
I'm glad you said it like that because I wonder if they really went about it without thinking of it in practical terms and more of what's just a neat design thing,
Yeah,
which
and maybe I'm being unfair, maybe that
right,
like, but I do feel like there's that, like I said, design language where it's like they're trying to evoke the same feeling that you got from the original Gundam, but they
right.
didn't really, like, think it out all the way.
Yeah,
Um, so now, again, Return of the King Kotoki here, and so
yeah.
now we're getting into, like, the 2010s era of mobile suit design, and the unicorn stands out probably among all main Gundam designs, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I bring this up a lot, but I mainly got into Gundam because of the full armor unicorn.
Yeah.
But if I am to take a step back and observe Unicorn as someone that had been into Gundam up into Gundam Unicorn, I would be amazed at this design because of the idea of it's closed. So then the V fin becomes a unicorn horn. Like that's kind of a neat idea, but also it retains that silhouette, but modernizes it. It's not too busy, but where it seems like it's busy, there's functionality because the things open up. So
Right.
I think this
Those
is top
panel
tier.
lines are not just there for show, like, they are
Right.
part of the transformation.
Yeah. So this is top tier for me.
You know what? When I first saw the unicorn, I kind of despised it because it was so different, and now I've kind of got an appreciation for it, not only because it was Kotoki's first, because obviously Victory Gundam, you saw where he was trying to evoke the same design principles as Okawara's original RX-78 2. In Gundam Wing Endless Waltz, he had to go based off of Okawara's designs in Gundam Wing the series. But in Unicorn, we basically get Kotoki Unchained, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is a pure, like, I'm not beholden to anything that came before, and I'm not trying to redesign something that already exists. This is a purely, like, my design. And honestly, as far as I'm concerned, I like the closed form unicorn better than the destroy mode anyway. Like, if you were to take the
I agree.
unicorn horn off of it, to me, it looks like a grunt suit, like a Jagan.
Exactly. A badass special forces Jagan. Yeah, because the
Like, that's
visor, it's not a
that's fucking
typical,
awesome.
yeah, not a typical Gundam visor. It's more of, yeah, from a special forces GM type.
Yeah, and I think after I saw the RX-81 line from 0081, it definitely gave me more of an appreciation for this look.
Is that the G line?
Yeah, yeah, the G line.
Ah, okay. Yeah. Yeah, because the face does have kind of the similar look to it.
Yeah, and that's another thing. I'm glad that you brought up the face is, like, that face kind of has the same, there's no vents on it the way that,
Right.
like, the Zeta has or the, GPO2. I'm not a big fan of, like, the face vents that you see on, like, the typical Gundam designs.
Yeah, for me, it depends,
Yeah,
but
it's definitely a case by case basis.
yeah.
Um, so now we get into, sort of these later designs here. IBO, I was never a big fan of the, mecha design here. Um, these were done by Washio, or I guess I'm pronouncing that right, Washio. Um, you can definitely see the Evangelion creeping in here, right?
Is that the same designer?
No, no, I just mean, like,
Oh,
the
because
inspiration of, like, that kind of
yeah,
organic looking.
I didn't think of it until you just said it, but yes.
I mean, like, even just as a military weapon, this seems very impractical, right? Like, you've got exposed
Yeah.
parts in the waist that make it easy to destroy. You've got, like, very tiny legs, and, like, the back of the legs is totally exposed. Now, part of that is due because, I mean, this is only Form 4 of the Barbatos. Later on, the Barbatos gets more and more armor plated back onto it, but not that much.
Yeah, another thing too that's interesting is the red, like, power button. I'm not too sure yet if there's lore implications for any of that, but that also reminds me of Evangelion, because isn't there some sort of, uh and I'm looking it up, I don't see it for some reason, like some icon or something that's supposed to, or emblem on one of the EVA units, but
Yeah, something
I'm
like
not
that.
but yeah, that's funny that you say that because it really does evoke that, and I'm not too crazy about this design. This isn't my type of mecha
Yeah.
design, but watching the show, I am enjoying it. So it's another example of, like, it's just a good show,
Yeah,
but
the
yeah, the design,
story.
again, the big red, like, power symbols, it just, I don't know.
And maybe that's sort of an attempt to return to that, like, focal point of the design, right? Like, I guess I do like, especially in Form 4, the way that the shoulders and the chest have that sort of power button design, because it reminds me of, like, okay, we can't do the big green dot again, but, like, let's do something that
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
evokes that same, central design theme. a lot of vents for some reason. I
Yeah,
mean, I can't imagine that this thing would get very hot considering that there's not a whole lot of armor on it that would contain the heat, like, you
yeah,
have all these heat sinks, but, like, all of the internal machinery is exposed, so,
yeah, a lot of vents, a lot of vents.
um,
It's a different
n
design for Gundam, that's
yeah,
for sure.
for sure it's different, and I'll give it credit for that, it does stand out. Everyone's favorite Otagaki. What are your thoughts on the Otagaki Thunderbolt designs?
I think it's great. It's interesting how different it can be without not being too different. It's like it doesn't really stand out as, "Oh, the Gundam would never look like that," or could it's like there's things that could make sense. Then as you look deeper, you're like, "Well, that is kind of a departure, but it makes sense." So,
Yeah, I guess to your point, like, the ankle skirt is where it's supposed to be, the Gundam head looks like the Gundam head, like they didn't
yeah,
change he didn't change anything there. It really does look very similar to the existing full armor Gundam designs, maybe just with a couple of extra thrusters, a couple of
yeah.
extra, you know, um just a couple of extra moving parts, honestly. He doesn't add a whole lot in terms of, like, panel lines or, like, extra,
No.
greebles or anything like that. It very much is something that fits the design language of 0079.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, you bringing up the lack of panel lines, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, a lot of this looks like it could have been pulled out of the original, which is kind of the intent of Thunderbolt in a way, was kind of like playing homage to the original, so
Yeah. So now we have to close with the most recent Gundam design. Saito, aka JNT Head, is I believe how that's pronounced.
okay.
Jinthed, JNT Head, is the pseudonym that he assumed as a mecha designer. Now, I do actually have an interview here with him where he actually won the he won a design competition in order to become the mecha designer
Mm.
for Witch from Mercury, and the design actually had more of a witchy look, which the
Oh,
producers were like, "Scale that back. We don't like it. We don't want it to look like a witch, please." He had it so where the funnels like basically hovered around the head and came to a point like a witch hat.
that's cool.
Um,
I think they should have
yeah,
leaned into that more.
it could have been interesting. He says that when he was a kid, he was really into SD Gundam, and he only watched the anime series after entering his 30s. So something that you and he have in common.
Yeah.
So yeah, his favorites were Double O and Gundam Unicorn, which brought him where he is today, entering a design competition for the Witch from Mercury. Now, what are your thoughts about this design? You brought up Witch from Mercury a couple times already, but
Yeah, I like this design. Um, yeah, I like it. But not as a main Gundam, like, to me, this is like a cool bad guy looking suit, in my opinion,
it
because
looks
it's kinda.
aggressive.
Yeah, exactly, that's
Yeah.
kind of the thing, it's kind of aggressive, I think the bigger bug-like eyes kinda help with, everything that's going on with it, yeah, aggressive is a good way to put it because the chest is large, angular, the arms have good proportions for just any sort of like combat. And then, yeah, with the legs, the larger upper portion kind of gives it that meteor stance. Yeah.
Yeah. I am a big fan of the proportions of this suit, but I think that with the additional panel lining and stuff, it does give me too much of that IBO vibe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where it's just kind of noisy for the sake of it
Yeah.
and it doesn't really contribute. Yeah. Although I do like the
Ex
idea with the shield breaking out into bits.
That is a neat touch for
Yeah.
sure. But we are coming to the end of the hour, and we just barely made it through all of these different Gundam designs. So yeah, the interesting evolution over time as far as Gundam designs go. As always, thank you for your insights here, Adam. I
No problem. This is fun
especially
to talk.
because yeah, this is the kind of stuff that I know you're into.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you guys so much for chatting with us, for hanging out during this, and hopefully you learned something. um,
Oh, yeah. I did.
yeah, check us out tomorrow on the Gundam Explained show, and
That's right.
until then, we will catch you later.
See you all.